Buckingham Palace, July 1917. A king sat alone at a writing desk, and the thing he was about to sign had nothing to do with armies or borders or treaties. It had to do with a name outside the palace windows. London was a city learning to live with the sound of engines overhead. German airships and bombers had been crossing the Channel for 2 years now, dropping their loads on a population that had never imagined war reaching this far from the front, and in a strange twist that no propaganda office could have invented. One of the newer German bombers carrying out these raids was called the Gotha. That word, Gotha, was also half of the King of England's own family name. He was George V, and the house he belonged to was called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a name inherited from his grandfather, Prince Albert, a name that had sounded perfectly respectable for 60 years and now sounded, to a grieving and frightened public, like something the enemy might answer to. Newspapers had started asking the question out loud: how could the king who ruled Britain carry a German title while German bombs fell on British children? A popular writer had gone further, calling the royal court alien and uninspiring, and the insult had stuck in a way that wounded more than any battlefield report. So George picked up his pen, and he did something no king of England had ever done before. He renamed his own family. Not Saxe-Coburg, not Gotha. He chose a word that meant nothing about bloodlines or ancestry at all. He chose the name of a castle. Windsor. It sounds like a small thing, a formality, a line in a court circular. It was not small. A king had just admitted, without saying it out loud, that the crown could no longer survive on blood alone. It needed a story the public could trust, and if the old story had become a liability, the family would simply write a new one. This is the story of what that decision cost, generation after generation, for the next 100 years. A man who gave up his throne for a woman, a boy who never wanted to be king and had to learn to speak in public through sheer terror, a young queen who got the news of her father's death while sitting in a tree in Africa, a princess who turned a camera into the only weapon she had, a funeral that nearly broke the family's bond with its own country. Every one of them, in their own way, sat down at a desk like George V did that July morning. Every one of them had to decide how much of themselves they were willing to sign away to keep the name alive. Windsor Castle, December 1840. A German prince was decorating a tree. His name was Albert, and he had married the Queen of England 2 years earlier, and he had brought with him a habit from his childhood home that the British public found charming and a little exotic. In Germany, families set up evergreen trees inside their homes at Christmas, hung with candles and ornaments and small gifts tied to the branches. Albert did not invent this tradition in Britain, but he set one up at Windsor for his own children, and an illustration of the royal family gathered around it eventually made its way into newspapers, and within a few years, half of Britain was doing the same thing in their own front rooms. He had made it fashionable. He had made it royal. Eventually, he had made it ordinary, which is its own kind of victory. It is a small, warm detail, the kind of thing people forget has a German fingerprint on it at all, and that forgetting is exactly the point. For most of the 1800s, nobody in Britain thought very hard about how German the royal family actually was. They were just the royal family, but the numbers, if anyone had bothered to add them up, were almost comic. Britain's monarchy had been German in some essential sense since 1714, when a German prince from Hanover, who barely spoke English, crossed the sea to take the throne because he happened to be the closest Protestant relative available. For 200 years after that, the family kept marrying German princes and German princesses, generation after generation, because that was simply how European royalty worked. Kings did not marry commoners. They married other royal houses. And most of the royal houses left standing in Europe by the 1800s happened to be German. Queen Victoria married a German prince. Her children married into German courts. By the time her grandson George was born, the family tree of European royalty looked less like a map of separate nations and more like one enormous, tangled family reunion that happened to be wearing different crowns. The Kaiser of Germany, the man who would one day order Zeppelin and Gotha raids over London, was Victoria's own grandson. He called the British royal family his cousins, because that is precisely what they were. This was not seen as a problem. For most of the 19th century, it was seen as a strength. A continent stitched together by family ties was supposed to be a continent less likely to go to war with itself. Kings, who shared Christmas dinners, in theory, did not send armies against each other. Then came the summer of 1914, and the theory collapsed in about 6 weeks. It is worth sitting with how strange that collapse actually was. George V, the Kaiser of Germany Wilhelm, and the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, were bound together by blood and marriage so tightly that the war felt, at the very top of Europe, like a family tearing itself apart. There exists a photograph from a royal wedding in Berlin in 1913, the last great gathering of European royalty before everything broke, showing the 3 men standing together, dressed in nearly identical military uniforms, looking for all the world like brothers posing for a family portrait. Within a year, their countries were sending millions of young men to die in trenches against each other. George wrote in his diary that he could not understand how Wilhelm, a man he had known his entire life, a man who used to call him Cousin Georgie, could have allowed the war to happen at all. The personal relationships had meant nothing once the machinery of national rivalry started moving. Blood had not stopped a single bullet, and once the killing started, the family connections that had once been a point of royal pride became something closer to a public scandal. The British people did not care that the king's German relatives were technically on the other side of a complicated continental rivalry they had not asked to play any part in. They cared that German soldiers were killing their sons, and that the man sitting on the British throne shared a surname with the enemy. It got worse before it got better, as the war dragged into its 3rd year, with casualty lists growing longer every week and food running short on British tables. The public mood toward anything German curdled into something closer to hatred. German shops in London were vandalized. Families with German-sounding names anglicized them to avoid trouble. Dachshund owners reportedly stopped walking their dogs in public because the breed was considered too German to be seen with. It sounds almost absurd from a distance, but it captures exactly how thin the line had become between symbol and reality. And sitting at the very top of that resentment, whether he had asked for it or not, was a king whose own family name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. George V was, by most accounts, about as British as a man could be. In temperament, he loved sailing. He loved stamp collecting. He spoke with a clipped naval bark that had nothing exotic about it at all. He had grown up in the British court, served in the British Navy, and felt about as German, in his own heart, as any Englishman of his generation. The accusation that he was somehow foreign infuriated him, precisely because it felt so unfair. But kings do not get to argue with how the public feels. They only get to respond to it. So, in the summer of 1917, with the war grinding through its bloodiest stretch and German bombers still droning over London at night, George made the decision that would define his family for the next century. He could not change his blood. He could not undo 200 years of German marriages. What he could change was the name on the door. He chose Windsor, after the castle that had stood west of London for nearly 900 years. A name with no foreign echo at all. A name that sounded like solid English stone. When the announcement was made public, it was framed as a simple modernization, a tidying up of an old-fashioned German title that no longer suited the times. Few people were told the truth directly, which was that the Crown had looked at its own name and decided it was now a liability serious enough to require erasing. There is a story, almost certainly polished in the retelling, but too good not to mention, that when the Kaiser heard about his cousin's decision, he made a joke that he was looking forward to seeing a performance of the opera called The Merry Wives of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha. The wit landed because everyone understood the joke underneath it. A king had just rewritten his own family history because the old version had become too dangerous to keep wearing in public. It worked. The name change did exactly what it was designed to do. The British public, exhausted and angry and looking for any reassurance that their king was truly on their side, accepted Windsor without much resistance. The war ended a year later. The Crown survived. But look at what happened to the family's relatives across that same stretch of years. The cousins who did not, or could not, perform the same trick. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas, George's cousin, the man who looked so much like him in that 1913 photograph that people sometimes confused the two, was forced to abdicate. In the very same year, George changed his name. Nicholas and his wife and their 5 children were held under house arrest, then moved further into the Russian interior. And, in July of 1918, revolutionary soldiers executed the entire family in a basement, shooting them and finishing the job with bayonets when the bullets alone did not kill quickly enough. George had been asked, quietly, whether Britain might offer his cousin's family asylum. He hesitated, worried about the political cost of sheltering a deposed tyrant during a war his own people were dying in, and the offer was eventually withdrawn. By the time anyone moved with real urgency, it was too late. In Germany, the Kaiser fared better in the sense that he kept his life, but lost everything else. Defeated and disgraced at the end of the war, Wilhelm abdicated and fled into exile in the Netherlands, where he spent the rest of his decades chopping wood on a borrowed estate. A former emperor, with no empire left to rule, in Austria, the centuries-old Habsburg monarchy, one of the oldest and grandest royal houses in European history, simply dissolved. The last emperor, Charles, was sent into exile and died young and poor on a small Portuguese island. A man who had inherited a throne that no longer existed by the time he understood what he held. Set those 3 stories beside George V signing a piece of paper in a quiet London office, and the comparison becomes almost unbearable. A cousin executed in a basement, a cousin chopping wood in exile, a cousin dying poor on an island, and in London, a king who looked at the wind, changing direction, and simply changed his name to match it. This is the lesson the House of Windsor carried forward from its very first act as a family. Blood did not save the Romanovs. Blood did not save the Hohenzollerns. Blood did not save the Habsburgs. What the British royal family had just learned in the most brutal classroom Europe could offer, was that survival in the modern world would not come from bloodline or birthright at all. It would come from the willingness to become whatever the public needed them to be, even if that meant erasing the very name they had carried for 200 years. The crown had just learned its first and most important rule, and it was about to be tested by a king's son who believed that rule did not apply to him at all. A few weeks before George V picked up that pen, a German bomber crossed the Channel in broad daylight and dropped its load on a London schoolyard. It was June of 1917, and the raid killed a number of small children at their desks. An act of war so visible and so close to home that it changed the entire tone of how Britain talked about the enemy. These were not the Zeppelins people had grown used to seeing drift slowly overhead at night. This was a new kind of aircraft, faster, heavier, flying high enough that London's defences struggled to even reach it. And it kept coming back, week after week. Through that summer, the bomber was called the Gotha. Nobody in Germany had named it after the British royal family. The aircraft took its name from the city where it was built, an old German manufacturing town that happened to share its name with the second half of the royal house's own title, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The connection was pure coincidence, a historical accident with no design behind it at all, but coincidence does not care about intent, and a nation burying its children was in no mood for nuance. Every time a newspaper printed the word Gotha that summer, whether describing a bomber overhead or a royal title on a coin, the two meanings sat close enough together that people stopped being able to keep them apart. The king carried a piece of the enemy's name in his own. The criticism did not stay polite for long. H.G. Wells, already one of the most famous writers in the country, wrote publicly that Britain needed what he called an alien and uninspiring court swept away. It was a brutal thing to say about the head of state during wartime, and it landed exactly where Wells intended it to land. George read it. By most accounts, it stung more than almost anything else printed about him during the war. He could not produce evidence that he loved Britain more than his German cousins did. He could only change what people saw when they looked at him. There is a story, repeated so often it has nearly become legend, that George answered Wells with a single cutting line. "I may be uninspiring," he is supposed to have said, "but I will be damned if I am alien." Whether the exact words are accurate or polished by later retelling, the sentiment behind them was real. A private secretary named Lord Stamfordham did much of the actual labour of finding a solution, and he understood that this was not a problem a strongly worded statement could fix. It needed something the public could hold on to, a new name, one that sounded permanent, one that sounded English in a way that felt obvious rather than forced. They landed on Windsor. After the castle that had stood above the River Thames since the days of William the Conqueror, nearly 900 years of continuous royal use. The oldest occupied castle in the world, nobody could accuse a name like that of sounding alien. On the 17th of July, 1917, the proclamation went out. The royal family would no longer be the House of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha. From that day forward, they were the House of Windsor. What the announcement did not say out loud, because it could not say it out loud, was the deeper truth sitting underneath it. A king had just demonstrated that the British monarchy no longer drew its authority from bloodline alone. It drew authority from the story the public was willing to believe about that bloodline. And when the old story stopped working, the family did not defend it. They replaced it. The bombs kept falling for another year. The war ground on toward its exhausted conclusion. But the question of whether the King of England was secretly German in his loyalties had, for most practical purposes, been answered with a single signature. George V had just established the operating principle that every single one of his descendants would live by for the next century. Whether they wanted to or not, the crown does not survive because it is owed survival. It survives because it adapts faster than the public's patience runs out. The name on the door matters more than the blood underneath it, because the public can see the name, and the public cannot see the blood at all. That principle would be tested again and again in the decades that followed. It would be tested by a king who decided he wanted to write his own story instead of the family's story. It would be tested by a war that bombed the family's own home in London. It would be tested by a television camera that walked uninvited into the most private moments of a coronation. And it would be tested, eventually, by a granddaughter-in-law who used the very same tool, public storytelling, to crack the family's carefully managed image wide open from the inside. But all of that was still ahead. For now, in 1917, the lesson had been learned, and the lesson had worked. A king had looked at a crisis no army could fix, and he had solved it with a piece of paper. The House of Windsor was born that summer, not from conquest, not from inheritance, but from fear, and from the willingness to become whatever the public needed in order to keep believing. His son would inherit that lesson, and his son would be the first to ignore it completely. A radio studio at Windsor Castle. The night of December the 11th, 1936. A man sat in front of a microphone, and his hands, by the accounts of people standing in the room, were not entirely steady. He was Edward, and until a few hours earlier he had been King of England. The head of the family his father had renamed 19 years before to save it from collapse. Now he was about to speak to his former subjects for the last time as a private citizen, and the words he was about to say would become some of the most quoted in the history of the British monarchy. "You must believe me," he said, "when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." It was 11 months. That is how long Edward had actually reigned as king. 11 months. And then he gave it all away for a twice-divorced American woman named Wallis Simpson. And in doing so, he became the only British monarch in modern history to voluntarily walk away from the throne. To understand how strange and how dangerous this was for the family, his father had just spent so much effort rebuilding. You have to understand who Edward had been before any of this happened. As Prince of Wales, he had been, by a wide margin, the most famous and most photographed man in the world. He was handsome in a boyish, slightly delicate way, fashionable, charming in public, and seemingly tireless in his royal duties, touring the empire, visiting coal miners, shaking hands with veterans. Crowds adored him. Newspapers could not get enough of him. He seemed, on the surface, to be exactly the kind of modern, visible, camera-ready monarch that his father's generation had decided the family needed to become. Underneath that surface, the people closest to him saw something different. He was restless, easily bored, allergic to the routine discipline that royal duty actually required day after day. Year after year, he had a long history of relationships with married women, and his father reportedly worried, more than once, about what kind of king his eldest son would actually turn out to be. George V is said to have remarked privately that he prayed nothing would come between Bertie, his quieter, more dutiful second son, and the throne, because he feared what Edward might do with it. Wallis Simpson entered Edward's life in the early 1930s, and by the time his father died in January of 1936 and Edward became king, she was already the most important person in his world. She was American, sharp-witted, twice married, with one divorce already finalized and a second in progress. And absolutely nothing about her fit the role the British establishment expected a queen to occupy. The objections were not subtle. The Church of England, which the king served as official head, did not recognize divorce as grounds for remarriage while a former spouse was still living, which meant a king married to a twice-divorced woman created a direct theological contradiction at the very center of the monarchy. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, made clear that a marriage to Simpson would not be politically survivable. The press, remarkably, stayed almost completely silent on the relationship for months, an extraordinary act of self-censorship by British newspapers that simply would not happen in any later decade of royal history. While American papers covered almost nothing else, Edward was given the choices that every king before him in this position would have understood without needing them spelled out. Give up Simpson and keep the crown, or keep Simpson and give up everything else. He chose Simpson. It is worth asking the harder question, sitting underneath the romantic version of this story, the one about a king who sacrificed everything for true love. Was this love, or was this the first real crack in the entire idea his father had built 19 years earlier? The idea that members of this family existed to serve a story larger than themselves. George V had renamed the entire dynasty rather than let his own family identity become a liability to the nation. He had sacrificed something real, a name carried by generations, in order to give the public a version of the monarchy it could trust. Edward, less than 2 decades later, looked at that same bargain and decided he was not willing to make it. He wanted Wallis Simpson more than he wanted to be the symbol his father had spent a lifetime constructing. There is no need to villainize him for that. Plenty of people, looking at the same choice, might make the same one. A private life, a real marriage, built on something other than duty, is not an unreasonable thing for a person to want. Even a person born into a role with no exit door built in, but the family he was abandoning had only just learned, in the bloodiest classroom imaginable, that survival depended on every single member putting the institution ahead of the individual. Edward broke that rule in his very first year on the throne, and the people who had to clean up after him understood exactly what kind of precedent that set. The abdication was finalized on December the 10th. 1936. Edward signed the instrument of abdication that morning, surrounded by his 3 younger brothers, one of whom, the nervous, stammering Duke of York, was about to become king in his place, with almost no preparation at all. The next night, Edward gave his radio address, explaining himself to the nation he was leaving behind. Then he left Britain entirely, sailing into a long, strange exile that would last the rest of his life, given a hollow new title, the Duke of Windsor, a name that must have felt almost cruel in its irony, carrying his father's chosen word for permanence, while being the first member of the family to prove that nothing about this arrangement was actually permanent at all. He married Wallis Simpson the following year in France. The 2 of them lived out their decades in a strange, gilded, purposeless exile, wealthy, fashionable, frequently photographed, and almost entirely cut off from any real role in British public life. There were darker chapters too. A deeply controversial visit to Nazi Germany in 1937 that included a meeting with Hitler, photographs of which would follow Edward for the rest of his life, and which his family, back in Britain, found almost impossible to forgive. He was never fully welcomed back into the institution he had walked away from. He attended his brother's funeral. He attended his niece's coronation, seated at a distance, a curiosity more than a participant. He died in Paris in 1972, and Wallis lived on for another 14 years in the same house, increasingly isolated, before dying there herself. What Edward left behind, more than any single scandal, was a question that would echo through every subsequent generation of his family. He had proven that the crown could survive losing a king. It had not been tested before, not in the modern era, not under these conditions. A sudden vacancy created not by death or war, but by one man's refusal to keep playing his assigned part. The institution held. The country did not collapse. A replacement was found within days, but the lesson cut both ways, and it would not be forgotten. Choosing yourself over the family's story was possible. It had been done. The price for doing it was total exile from everything you had once belonged to. His younger brother, the man now being hastily prepared to take his place, understood that price better than almost anyone alive. He had spent his entire life in Edward's shadow, assuming he would never sit on the throne, terrified of public speaking to the point of genuine physical distress, utterly unprepared for the job that had just been dropped onto him with no warning at all. He did not want this. He had never wanted this, and in choosing to take it anyway, he was about to prove that the family's survival had never really depended on confidence, or charisma, or even desire. It depended on a willingness to show up and do the part, even when every instinct in your body was screaming at you to run the other way. Buckingham Palace. A private room? Sometime in the late 1920s, a man stood in front of a microphone that was not even turned on, sweating through his collar, trying to get through a single sentence without his voice locking up on him. His name was Albert, called Bertie by his family, and he had stammered since he was a small boy. It was not a mild hesitation. By his own description, and the description of those close to him, certain consonants could trap him for what felt like an eternity. His jaw working, no sound coming out. An audience watching him fight his own body in real time. For a prince, expected to give public speeches as a basic function of his job, this was not an inconvenience. It was closer to a daily nightmare. He had tried nearly everything available at the time. Doctors who told him to smoke to relax his throat. Specialists who made him talk with marbles in his mouth. An old and largely useless technique borrowed from ancient legend rather than actual medicine. Nothing worked, and the public humiliation of his stammer followed him into adulthood. Most painfully, in 1925, when he had to deliver a speech opening the British Empire exhibition at Wembley Stadium in front of a packed crowd and a live radio broadcast reaching millions. He got through it, technically, but the strain was visible to everyone listening, and Bertie himself considered it one of the worst experiences of his life. This was the man who, on the 10th of December, 1936, found out his older brother had abdicated and that he was now, with no preparation, no warning, and no desire whatsoever, the King of England. People who were in the room when he learned the news described him as devastated. He reportedly broke down in front of his mother, telling her he had no idea what to do, that he had never wanted this, that he had been trained for nothing in his entire life except standing slightly behind his brother. He took the name George VI rather than keeping his own name, Albert, a deliberate choice meant to signal continuity with his father George V, and to put as much distance as possible between the new reign and the chaos his brother had just walked away from. But a name change alone does not fix a stammer, and a stammer is a serious problem when your entire job in this new media age, your father had only begun to navigate, depends on being heard, speaking clearly and confidently to your own people. This is where Lionel Logue enters the story. An Australian speech therapist with no formal medical degree and an unconventional, almost theatrical approach to treatment. Logue had Bertie do breathing exercises that felt closer to physical training than therapy. He had him swear loudly in private sessions, on the theory that profanity sometimes flowed more freely than ordinary speech because it bypassed the part of the brain where the stammer originated. He worked with Bertie not as a patient to be fixed quickly, but as a partner in a slow, grinding process that took years rather than weeks. The two men became genuinely close, an unlikely friendship between a king and a commoner from the other side of the world, built entirely around the shared, exhausting project of getting Bertie through a sentence without breaking. The improvement was real, but it was never total. Bertie continued to struggle with his speech for the rest of his life. What changed was not that the stammer disappeared. What changed was that he learned to manage it, to push through it, to keep going, even when a word caught in his throat, in front of a live microphone with the entire nation listening. And then, less than 3 years into his reign, he had to do exactly that under the highest possible stakes. On the 3rd of September, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. That evening, George VI had to address the nation by radio, a speech that needed to convey calm, resolve, and unity. At the exact moment, millions of his subjects were terrified of what was coming. There was no version of this moment that did not require him to stand in front of a microphone and speak clearly for several minutes straight. He prepared for that broadcast the way he had prepared for every difficult speech since meeting Logue. Breathing exercises beforehand, careful pacing built into the script, Logue himself present in the room to help steady him. The recording survives, and if you listen closely, you can hear the effort in it, the careful, deliberate rhythm of a man choosing his pace with enormous concentration, rather than speaking with natural fluency. But he got through it. He told his people that they were now at war, that the cause was just, and that he asked them to stand calm and firm and united in this time of trial. It was not a flawless performance. It was something more valuable than flawless. It was visibly, audibly human. A man working hard, in real time, to lead his country through fear. And the country responded to that effort with exactly the trust he needed from them. Set this beside his older brother for a moment, because the contrast is the entire point of this chapter. Edward had been effortless, photogenic, fluent, charming in every public appearance. A king who looked like he belonged on the throne the way a film star belongs on a poster. And when the moment came to choose between his own desires and the role his family needed him to play, he chose himself, and he left. Bertie was the opposite in almost every visible way. Awkward, halting, visibly uncomfortable in the spotlight that had never been built for him. And when the moment came, the same moment in a different form, the choice between what he wanted for himself and what the institution needed him to be, he chose the institution. Every single time. For the rest of his life, Edward chose himself. George VI chose duty. That single difference, more than any policy or any war strategy, became the foundation the entire House of Windsor would stand on for the rest of the century. The crown did not need a king who was naturally gifted at being king. It needed a king who would show up anyway, who would fight through his own limitations in public, rather than walk away from them, because the public could forgive struggle far more easily than it could forgive abandonment. George VI never wanted the throne his brother handed him. He spent every day of his reign doing a job that cost him visible, physical effort just to perform its most basic public function, and in doing exactly that, stammering through it, fighting through it, never once quitting, he did more to restore the public's trust in the House of Windsor than almost anyone since his own father had renamed the family 20 years earlier. The real test of that trust, though, was still coming. It would not arrive through a microphone in a quiet room. It would arrive through the sky over London, falling in the form of German bombs. And it would force the entire royal family out onto a balcony they could not avoid, in front of a city that needed, more than anything else, to see that their king was suffering alongside them. Buckingham Palace, September the 13th, 1940. A bomb fell directly into the quadrangle of the palace, close enough that the king and queen, standing together in a nearby room, felt the blast shake the windows and heard the glass shatter around them. This was not a near miss happening somewhere else in London. This was the German Air Force hitting the actual home of the King and Queen of England, the seat of the very institution. The family had spent 23 years rebuilding since George V changed its name. Over the following weeks of what came to be called the Blitz, the palace would be struck multiple times. Its chapel destroyed entirely in one raid. Buckingham Palace was, by this point, in 1940, sitting in the middle of a city under sustained nightly bombardment. German bombers crossed the Channel after dark, night after night for months, dropping their loads across London in an effort to break the morale of British civilians before any planned invasion. Whole streets of working-class housing in the East End were flattened. Families slept in basements, in subway tunnels, in backyard shelters made of corrugated metal, listening to the drone of engines overhead and waiting to find out, each morning, what had survived the night and what had not. The royal family had options that ordinary Londoners did not have. They could have evacuated to the countryside, to Windsor Castle, or further still, out of range of the nightly raids, and kept the government and the monarchy running from somewhere safer. There were people in the government who quietly suggested exactly that. George VI and his wife Elizabeth refused. The Queen put the reasoning in words that became one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. The children, meaning the two young princesses, would not leave unless she did. She would not leave unless the king did. And the king would not leave. Full stop. Because the people of London could not leave their own homes. And a king who fled the bombs his own subjects had to endure was not a king worth having. "I am glad we have been bombed," she reportedly said after the palace itself was hit. "It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." This was the calculation, conscious or not, that defined the entire Windsor survival strategy from 1917 onward, now playing out under the most extreme possible conditions. The monarchy did not survive because it commanded armies or controlled parliament. By the 20th century, it had almost no direct political power at all. It survived because the public believed the family was genuinely on their side, genuinely sharing in whatever the nation was going through, and there was no more powerful proof of that belief than a king and queen who stayed in a city being bombed nightly, in a palace that had itself taken direct hits. Rather than retreating somewhere safe, the two young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, were moved out to Windsor Castle for safety during the worst of the bombing, 12 miles outside London. But the king and queen themselves remained based at Buckingham Palace through most of the war, travelling daily into the city to inspect bomb damage, visit hospitals, and walk through the rubble of neighbourhoods that had been hit the night before. Photographs from this period show the king and queen picking their way across collapsed brick and broken glass in formal clothes, stopping to talk with families who had just lost their homes, sometimes their relatives, standing in the wreckage of everything they owned. And then there was the balcony, the image that came to define this entire period, the one that newsreels and photographers returned to again and again, was the royal family standing together on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the same palace that had just been bombed, waving to crowds gathered below in a city under nightly attack. It became a kind of ritual through the war years, a visible, repeated signal that the family was still there, still standing, still in the same city, absorbing the same danger as everyone looking up at them. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the second great symbol this family built for itself, alongside the name their grandfather had chosen in 1917. The name was the story they told about who they were. The balcony was the place they had to physically stand to prove that story was true. It was a stage with no script and no escape route, a place where the family could not simply claim loyalty to their people. They had to show up, in person, in a city actively being bombed, and let themselves be seen. Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May of 1940, just as the worst of the war began, understood exactly how valuable this partnership was. He and the king developed a close working relationship over the following years, meeting privately on a regular basis throughout the war. The king coming to genuinely trust and rely on Churchill's leadership, even though the two men had started on uncertain footing, since Churchill had actually supported Edward during the abdication crisis just a few years earlier. By the height of the war, that early tension had been replaced by something closer to real partnership. Two men carrying the public face of British resistance from two different directions. The elected leader giving the speeches that explained the strategy. The king giving the visible, steady presence that reminded people what they were actually fighting to protect. By the time the war ended, in 1945, the House of Windsor had passed the most severe test it had faced since the name change itself. A king with a speech impediment that should have disqualified him from public leadership had instead delivered, through sheer effort, some of the most important broadcasts in British history. A palace that had been bombed had become proof of solidarity rather than a symbol of vulnerability. A family that could have hidden in the countryside had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to stand on a balcony in a city under fire. George VI never fully recovered his health after the war. The strain of the role he had never wanted, combined with heavy smoking and the exhausting pace of his wartime duties, wore him down steadily through the following years. He died in his sleep in February of 1952, only 56 years old. A king who had reigned for just over 15 years and had spent nearly all of them either preparing for war, surviving war, or recovering from it. He left behind two daughters who had grown up almost entirely inside this wartime version of the monarchy. the version built on visible sacrifice and physical presence rather than distant ceremony. The elder of the two, a young woman in her mid-20s, was on the other side of the world when the news of her father's death reached her, sitting in a treehouse in Kenya, watching wildlife at a hotel called Treetops, with no idea that the moment she climbed back down, she would be doing so as the new Queen of England. Treetops Hotel, Kenya, February the 6th, 1952. A young woman climbed up into a hotel built inside the branches of a giant fig tree to watch elephants and rhinos gather at a waterhole below. And somewhere in the hours that followed, without her knowing it, her father died in his sleep on the other side of the world, and she became Queen of England. She was Elizabeth, 25 years old. On the first major overseas tour, she and her husband Philip had undertaken as a working royal couple, standing in for her father, George VI, whose health had been failing for months. The trip had started in Kenya as the first leg of a much longer tour that was supposed to take them on to Australia and New Zealand. Instead, it stopped there entirely, in a small lodge in the African bush, with the news arriving by a chain of small mishaps and delays that meant Elizabeth was, by some accounts, one of the last people in the world to learn she was now queen. The story of how the news actually reached her has been told and retold so many times that some of the details blur depending on the source. But the core of it remains striking. A journalist covering the trip is said to have picked up the news first, through contacts back in London, and the awful task of confirming it and informing Philip, who then had to tell his wife, fell to the people closest to her on the ground. Philip reportedly took her for a walk in the garden of the lodge where they were staying and told her there, away from the staff, away from cameras, the only privacy either of them would have for what was coming. What the people present that day remembered afterward was not grief exactly, though grief was certainly there. It was the speed of the transformation. One observer described her as looking as though the weight of the world had been thrust upon her shoulders. There was no time for mourning to run its natural course before duty asserted itself. A queen does not get to simply be a daughter who has lost her father. Within hours she was approving travel arrangements, signing her name for the first time as Elizabeth II, and preparing to fly home, not as a princess returning from a trip, but as the head of state of a nation she had not even known. That morning, that she would soon be leading, she landed at London Airport in a black coat, and Churchill himself, by then back in office as Prime Minister, was waiting on the tarmac, having reportedly wept upon hearing the news of George VI's death and remarked privately that he barely knew the young woman who was about to become his queen. One image was a young woman watching elephants from a tree. The next was a young woman descending an aeroplane staircase into a phalanx of black-suited officials. There is no transition period built into this job. There is only before and after, and the gap between them can be closed in the time it takes to fly from Nairobi to London. She was crowned the following year, in June of 1953, in a coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey, built around a series of vows that had been spoken, in various forms, by British monarchs for nearly 1,000 years. But it was something she had said 2 years before her coronation. On her 21st birthday, broadcast by radio from South Africa, while her father was still alive and well, that would come to define her entire reign more than any ceremony ever could. "I declare before you all," she had said, "that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." A 21-year-old, not yet queen, not yet certain she ever would be, soon, stood in front of a microphone and made a vow with no escape clause. No retirement date. No conditions attached. She did not know, at 21, that her life would in fact be extraordinarily long, that the promise she was making would eventually stretch across 7 decades and require her to keep showing up, in public, in service, through the death of nearly everyone she loved, through the collapse of the British Empire she had been born into, through scandals involving nearly every member of her own family, through a world that would change almost beyond recognition by the time she was finished keeping it. She did not inherit a crown the way her father had been handed a throne by his brother's sudden abdication. What she inherited, more precisely, was a promise she had made to herself years before the job actually arrived. And from the moment she landed back in London in 1952, every single day of her life would be organized around the project of keeping that promise, regardless of what it cost her personally. Her grandfather had renamed the family to survive a crisis. Her uncle had walked away from the family's demands entirely. Her father had pushed through his own physical limitations because duty required it of him. Elizabeth, by contrast, did not arrive at duty as a response to crisis or an act of personal courage in a single moment. She arrived at it as a baseline, a starting condition she had committed herself to a year before any of it became real, and she would never, for the rest of her exceptionally long reign, publicly deviate from that commitment in any visible way. People who worked closely with her over the decades that followed often described the same quality in different words. A discipline so consistent it almost stopped looking like discipline and started looking like simple nature. The way water is simply wet rather than choosing to be wet. She rarely showed visible frustration in public. She almost never explained her private opinions on political matters, maintaining a strict and deliberate neutrality that had been a core feature of the constitutional monarchy since well before her reign began. She approached the job less like a performance to be delivered and more like an institution to be maintained. Brick by brick, appearance by appearance, decade by decade. It would be a mistake to read this as coldness, even though it would eventually be read that way by a public that had changed enormously by the end of her reign. What Elizabeth was building, starting from that tree house in Kenya and continuing for the next 70 years, was continuity itself. The single quality her family's entire survival strategy had always depended on most. But continuity alone was not going to be enough to navigate what was coming next. Because the world Elizabeth was stepping into was not the same world her father had ruled. A new technology was about to walk straight through the palace doors and change, permanently, what it meant to be a member of this family in public. Westminster Abbey, June the 2nd, 1953. A young woman knelt at the altar in a heavy embroidered gown, and somewhere above her, hidden carefully out of the direct line of sight of the most sacred part of the ceremony, a television camera was recording everything that happened, broadcasting it live to millions of households across Britain for the very first time in the history of the monarchy. That camera almost was not there at all. When plans for Elizabeth's coronation first began taking shape, the question of whether to allow television cameras inside Westminster Abbey produced a genuine fight behind palace walls. And the resistance came from exactly the people you might expect. Winston Churchill, still serving as Prime Minister, was firmly opposed. So was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So, by most accounts, was a significant portion of the traditional court establishment. Men who had spent their careers believing that the sacred core of monarchy depended entirely on distance and mystery. The idea that royal power worked precisely because ordinary people could not see too closely into how it actually functioned. The argument against television was not simply snobbery, though there was certainly some of that mixed in. It reflected a genuinely held belief, inherited from centuries of royal tradition, that majesty required mystique, and that mystique could not survive close inspection. A coronation was, after all, a deeply religious ceremony at its core, carrying the language of sacred kingship inside what was, in practice, a modern constitutional monarchy. The anointing with holy oil, considered the single most sacred portion of the ritual, was kept deliberately hidden from the cameras even after everything else was opened up. Churchill worried that broadcasting the entire event live, with all its small imperfections and unscripted human moments, would cheapen something that had always drawn its power from being witnessed only by a select few in person. Elizabeth herself, by most historical accounts, disagreed, and her view ultimately prevailed. This decision deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it represents the third great act of self-transformation this family undertook in less than 40 years. Her grandfather had changed the family's name to survive a war. Her father had turned the family's physical presence into a wartime symbol of shared suffering. Elizabeth, barely into her 20s, made the decision that would define the entire second half of the 20th century for her family. She let the cameras in. The coronation, broadcast live, drew an estimated audience of around 27 million people in Britain alone watching by television, with another 11 million listening by radio. Staggering numbers for a country whose total population was just over 50 million at the time. The broadcast reached additional millions abroad, including a substantial American audience watching footage flown across the Atlantic. People who had never owned a television bought their first set specifically to watch the ceremony, gathering in the homes of neighbors who already had one, crowding around small black and white screens in numbers that television manufacturers had never seen before. It was, in a very real sense, the moment television itself became a mass household technology in Britain, driven almost entirely by public hunger to watch their young queen crowned. What that decision did, in practical terms, was transform the monarchy from a remote, mostly textual institution, something people read about in newspapers and saw occasionally in newsreels at the cinema, into something they could watch unfold live in their own living rooms. The crown stopped being an idea people were told about and became an event people experienced directly, in real time, alongside millions of other households doing the exact same thing at the exact same moment. The trade involved here was not simple, and the family would spend the rest of the century working out its full consequences. The cameras saved the monarchy from a kind of slow irrelevance that might otherwise have been waiting for it, without the willingness to be seen, fully and directly, by an audience hungry for that access. It is entirely possible the British crown would have drifted further and further from public relevance as the century went on. The decision to broadcast the coronation set the template for everything that followed. Royal weddings, watched by hundreds of millions worldwide. Documentaries that followed the family through their daily routines. An entire genre of media built around granting the public a sense of intimacy with people who, by definition, were supposed to remain somewhat above and apart from ordinary life. But the same camera that saved the monarchy by making it visible would eventually make true privacy almost impossible for the people living inside it. Once the public had been given a taste of access, once they had been invited, literally, into the Abbey, for the most sacred ceremony the family possessed. There was no reasonable way to later tell them that other moments, other rooms, other private griefs and private joys were suddenly off limits. The appetite, once created, did not stay contained to the moments the family had chosen to share. Elizabeth could not have fully known, standing at that altar with the weight of the crown literally being placed on her head, that she was opening a door that would eventually let cameras follow her own son's marriage into a level of public scrutiny that would help destroy it. What she did know, in 1953, was simpler and more immediate. The country needed to see her. It needed proof that the promise she had made 2 years earlier, that her whole life would be devoted to service, was not just words spoken into a radio microphone in South Africa. The camera saved the monarchy that day, exactly as it was meant to. But cameras, once invited into a room, rarely agree to leave only the parts you wanted them to see. They stay, they wait, and eventually, in rooms far less ceremonial than Westminster Abbey, they would record things this family never intended for the world to witness at all. Before any of that happened, though, there was a much quieter story unfolding just beside the new Queen, one that received almost none of the attention the coronation generated, and one that revealed, in a much smaller and sadder way, exactly how much this family was still willing to sacrifice in the name of protecting its own image. Clarence House, the early 1950s. A young woman stood beside her sister at the funeral of their father, dressed in the same heavy black mourning clothes, and almost nobody watching that day understood that her own life was about to be quietly taken apart by the very institution she had just watched her sister inherit. She was Princess Margaret, Elizabeth's younger sister, 21 years old when their father died, and for most of her early life she had occupied a strange and difficult position inside the family. She was royal, but not the heir, watched constantly by the public, but never destined to actually carry the weight of the crown. Photographed everywhere, her sister was photographed, but always standing one careful step behind, a permanent supporting character in a story that had already cast its lead before either of them understood what the roles meant. Margaret was, by most accounts from people who knew her, the livelier and more spontaneous of the two sisters. Where Elizabeth was careful and measured from a young age, Margaret had a reputation for wit, for glamour, for a kind of restless charm that made her genuinely popular with the British public, even as it occasionally worried the more traditional members of the royal household. She smoked. She enjoyed nightlife. She had a flair for the dramatic that her older sister simply did not share. Instead of becoming an asset, the very thing that made her interesting became the reason the institution moved so swiftly to control her. The story that defined Margaret's young adulthood, and in many ways shadowed the rest of her life, involved a man named Peter Townsend, a former Royal Air Force officer who had served as an equerry, a kind of personal attendant, to her father George VI during the war. Townsend was, by every account, a genuinely admirable man, a decorated fighter pilot who had flown in the Battle of Britain, steady, dependable, and close to the royal family for years before anything romantic developed between him and Margaret. He was also 16 years older than her, and he was divorced. In the Britain of the 1950s, only a few years after Edward had been forced off the throne entirely over the question of marrying a divorced woman, the idea of the king's own daughter marrying a divorced man carried an almost unbearable weight of institutional anxiety. Margaret, unlike Edward, was not the monarch and could not single-handedly bring down the government by insisting on the marriage. But she was close enough to the throne, and famous enough in her own right, that the establishment treated her relationship with Townshend as a serious and immediate problem, requiring careful management. The pressure that followed was not delivered as outright cruelty. It rarely is. In institutions built around the careful avoidance of scandal, it was delivered as quiet, persistent, procedural obstruction. Townshend was reassigned to a diplomatic posting in Brussels, conveniently distant from London. Margaret was made to wait, repeatedly, for permission and approval that never quite arrived in a form she could act on. Under the rules in place at the time, she would have needed the Queen's formal consent to marry while under 25. And even after she turned 25, and that legal requirement fell away, the practical reality remained that marrying Townshend would have meant giving up her royal income, her official duties, and very likely her place within the family's public life altogether. In 1955, after years of this slow, grinding pressure, Margaret issued a public statement announcing that she had decided not to marry Peter Townshend. The language of the statement leaned heavily on duty, on her awareness of the Church's teaching on marriage, and on what she described as her own conscience. Whether that conscience was entirely her own, or substantially shaped by years of institutional pressure applied by people who had every incentive to prevent the marriage, is a question that has been debated by historians and biographers ever since, and one that Margaret herself, by most accounts, never fully resolved in her own mind for the rest of her life. Set this story directly beside Edward's abdication 19 years earlier, because the contrast reveals something the family rarely said out loud, but clearly believed with total conviction. Edward had been the king. He held the actual throne, and when he chose Wallis Simpson over the crown, the institution let him go. Painful as that loss was, because losing one king was survivable in a way that losing the entire credibility of the monarchy was not. Margaret was never going to be queen. She was, in the family's own internal hierarchy, expendable in a way her sister never could be. And yet the pressure applied to her, the quiet machinery that worked for years to separate her from the man she loved, was in some ways more thorough and more relentless than anything applied to Edward, precisely because there was no abdication crisis required to stop her. She had no throne to give up as leverage. She only had her own wish, and the family simply outlasted it. This is the quieter, sadder half of the lesson. Edward's story had already taught the family in 1936. Choosing the institution over yourself was the price of remaining inside this family. Full stop. Regardless of whether you were ever going to wear the crown at all. Margaret went on to marry a photographer named Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960. A marriage that brought its own brief period of glamour and modern energy to the royal family before eventually ending in divorce. The first divorce of a senior royal in the 20th century, occurring quietly enough by then that it did not produce anything like the crisis Edward's situation had decades earlier. She spent much of the rest of her years navigating a public image that increasingly cast her as troubled, difficult, prone to controversy. The family member journalists reached for whenever they wanted a story that did not fit the careful, polished narrative built around her sister. She died in February of 2002, just weeks before her sister would mark 50 years on the throne, and many of the tributes that followed her death carried an unmistakable undercurrent of sympathy for a life that had, in its earliest and most formative years, been quietly shaped by an institution unwilling to bend, even slightly, for a love that threatened no one's claim to power at all. A few decades later, another young woman would walk into this same family carrying her own fairy tale, and the entire world would watch it unfold live on television, certain they were witnessing a love story. They were not entirely wrong, but they were not seeing the whole picture either. And neither, in the beginning, was she. St. Paul's Cathedral, London, July the 29th, 1981. A 19-year-old woman walked down the longest aisle in England, wearing a dress with a 25-foot train, and somewhere over 700 million people around the world were watching her do it, live, on television sets in nearly every country with a broadcast signal capable of receiving the satellite feed. She was Lady Diana Spencer, about to become Diana, Princess of Wales, and the wedding unfolding in front of that enormous global audience had been built, deliberately and carefully, to feel like something out of a fairy tale. The carriage procession through cheering London crowds, the cathedral filled with royalty and dignitaries from around the world, the dress itself, an enormous, almost theatrically romantic confection of ivory silk and antique lace, designed specifically to read as storybook royalty to a television audience watching from thousands of miles away. When the ceremony ended and the new couple appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony, the same balcony where George VI and his family had once stood through the Blitz, the crowd below began chanting for a kiss, and Charles and Diana obliged. The first time in modern royal history a married couple had kissed publicly on that balcony. A small unscripted moment that instantly became one of the most replayed images of the entire day. It looked, to a watching planet, like the conclusion of a story. In fact, it was closer to the very beginning of one, and the two people standing on that balcony were, in almost every meaningful way, strangers to each other. Charles, Prince of Wales, was 32 years old at the time of the wedding, 12 years older than his bride, and had spent his entire adult life as the most scrutinized heir to a throne in the world, a man whose every relationship, every hobby, every public statement had been analyzed for decades by a press desperate to determine when he would finally settle down and produce the next generation of the family. He had been linked romantically to a number of women over the years, including, significantly, a woman named Camilla Shand, later Camilla Parker Bowles, with whom he had a serious relationship years before he married Diana, a relationship that both of them, by most later accounts, never fully let go of, even after he married someone else. The pressure on Charles to marry, and specifically to marry someone considered suitable by the standards the institution still quietly maintained, someone young, of appropriate background, and crucially, with no prior serious romantic history of her own that might complicate the optics of a royal wedding, had been building for years by the time he met Diana. She fit nearly every requirement the institution was looking for. She came from an aristocratic English family with centuries of connections to the royal household. She was young enough, at 19, to have no public romantic history of her own for the press to dig into. She was, by every visual measure the cameras cared about, extraordinarily photogenic, shy in a way that read on screen as endearing rather than awkward. What very few people understood at the time, including quite possibly Diana herself, was how little of an actual relationship existed underneath all of that suitability. Charles and Diana had spent only a handful of occasions together before their engagement was announced. Diana later described, in interviews, given years afterward, a courtship that felt rushed and superficial, overseen as much by the demands of royal protocol and his family's expectations as by anything resembling normal, romantic discovery between two people getting to know each other. This is the tension sitting underneath the entire wedding. The gap between the story the world believed it was watching and the much more complicated reality unfolding just beneath the surface. The public saw a fairy tale because the institution had, by 1981, become extraordinarily skilled at producing exactly that kind of story, building on every lesson it had learned since George V changed the family's name 64 years earlier. They understood the power of spectacle. They understood what the camera wanted. Ever since Elizabeth's coronation had proven the public's hunger for direct visual access to these moments. They knew how to stage a balcony kiss that would become a defining image of an entire generation's relationship with the British monarchy. What the institution had not yet fully reckoned with, and what this marriage would eventually force them to confront in the most painful way imaginable, was what happens when the person living inside the fairy tale does not agree to keep performing it once the cameras have moved on. Charles represented, in nearly every sense, the family's traditional approach to its own survival. Duty inherited from birth, a role understood and accepted, however, reluctantly, at times, as something larger than personal preference. He had grown up watching his mother live out exactly this principle for decades. A queen who had never publicly complained, never publicly explained, never let personal feeling visibly interfere with institutional function. He expected, by every signal available to him from his own upbringing, that his marriage would operate by the same rules. Diana represented something the family had never really encountered before, not in quite this form. She was young enough to have grown up in a different media culture than her husband, one increasingly built around emotional disclosure, personal authenticity, and a public hungry not just to watch royal events from a respectful distance, but to feel genuinely connected to the people living inside them. Where Elizabeth had spent decades carefully maintaining distance even while allowing cameras into the room, Diana, whether by instinct or simply by the temperament of her own generation, understood almost immediately how to close that distance entirely. She made eye contact with crowds. She knelt down to speak with children at her own eye level rather than towering above them, as protocol might have suggested. She touched people, literally, shaking hands with AIDS patients in 1987, at a time when public fear and misinformation about the disease made that simple physical gesture a genuinely significant and widely reported act. In other words, without anyone fully realizing it, on that July morning in 1981, two completely different theories of how to survive as a public royal figure had just been married to each other in front of the entire world. One theory, inherited from George V through George VI through Elizabeth, said survival meant becoming a steady, controlled symbol, visible but never too personal. The other theory, which Diana was about to demonstrate with a fluency that startled even the institution that had selected her, said survival in this new media age meant the opposite. It meant being personal. It meant letting the public feel they knew the real person behind the title, not despite the cameras, but because of them. Both theories had worked, in their own eras, to keep this family standing through war and scandal and the loss of an empire. Neither theory had ever been tested directly against the other. Inside a single marriage, with the entire world watching the experiment play out in real time on the evening news, that test was just beginning, And within a few years, it would become clear that this particular fairy tale was not heading toward any kind of ending the institution had planned for at all. A townhouse in West London, November 1995. A BBC camera crew set up lights in a private sitting room, and on the other side of those lights sat Diana, Princess of Wales, about to give an interview that nobody in Buckingham Palace had approved. Nobody in Buckingham Palace had been told about in advance, and nobody in Buckingham Palace would be able to stop once it started airing. The programme was called Panorama, and the interview ran for just under an hour. And within that hour, Diana said more, directly to the British public, about the actual state of her marriage than any member of the royal family had ever said about their private life on television in the history of the institution. She spoke about Charles's continuing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles in a single line that would be quoted for decades afterward. There were 3 of us in this marriage, she said, so it was a bit crowded. She spoke about her own struggles with bulimia, about postnatal depression, about self-harm, about feeling isolated and unsupported inside a family, and a system that she described as treating her almost as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. And she spoke, perhaps most strikingly of all, about whether Charles was even suited to be king, raising doubts publicly about her own husband's fitness for the throne he was born to inherit. To understand how seismic this was, you have to go back to every single lesson this family had taught itself, generation after generation, about how to survive in public. George V changed the family's name rather than let a German word damage their public image. George VI pushed through a crippling stammer because duty required him to be heard, not to be honest about how hard that effort actually was. Elizabeth allowed the cameras into her coronation, but never, in 7 decades on the throne, gave an interview revealing her private opinions, private grievances, or private pain. The entire survival strategy of the House of Windsor, since the day it adopted that name, had rested on a single unbroken principle: control the story, never let the public see the seams. Diana had just walked directly into the most public room available to her and shown the entire world the seams. The marriage had been falling apart for years by this point, in ways that had already leaked out through tabloid coverage, competing biographies, and a series of increasingly damaging revelations on both sides. Charles had given his own television interview the year before, in 1994, in which he admitted to his affair with Camilla, a startling admission in its own right that had already badly damaged the institution's traditional wall of silence. Diana's Panorama interview, arriving just over a year later, was in some ways a direct response, an attempt to reclaim the narrative on her own terms rather than let it continue being shaped by her husband's allies and the palace machinery around him. What made Diana's version so much more dangerous to the institution was not simply the content of what she revealed. It was the method. She had not given this interview through any official channel. She had not run it past the Queen's press office, had not coordinated with the royal household's careful system of managed disclosure that had governed every previous instance of the family speaking publicly about itself. She had arranged the interview in secret, reportedly smuggling the BBC reporter and crew into Kensington Palace without informing senior staff. And the first that Buckingham Palace heard of any of it was when the broadcast had already been locked in and scheduled to air. This is the moment where the second great symbol of this family's survival, the camera, the very tool George VI and Elizabeth had, each in their own way, learned to use to bind the public to them, was turned directly against the institution by someone standing inside it. Every previous use of broadcast media by this family, going back to the coronation in 1953, had been carefully controlled, scripted, approved, designed to project exactly the image the family wanted the public to receive. Diana understood, perhaps better than anyone in the family's history before her, that the same camera could be used to do the opposite. It could be used to tell the truth, or at least her version of it, directly to millions of people, with no palace official standing between her words and the audience hearing them. An estimated 23 million people in Britain alone watched the interview when it aired. It became one of the most discussed pieces of television in modern British history, generating headlines for weeks, reshaping public opinion of both Charles and Diana, and putting pressure on the Queen that the institution had genuinely not faced in this form before. Within months, Elizabeth, by most historical accounts deeply uncomfortable with the public unravelling of her son's marriage, but increasingly convinced there was no way to contain it through traditional silence, sent Charles and Diana a letter strongly suggesting they divorce as quickly as possible. The divorce was finalised in August of 1996. It would be easy, looking back, to frame this entire episode as Diana single-handedly breaking a system that had functioned perfectly well before she arrived. That framing misses something important, though, something this story has been building toward since George V sat at his desk in 1917. The system Diana broke into pieces with that interview had never actually been about honesty. It had been about control, about managing exactly what the public was allowed to see, and when they were allowed to see it. Every member of this family, going back generations, had paid some version of the same price to maintain that control. Edward had been exiled for refusing to accept it. Margaret had given up the man she loved because of it. George VI had hidden the true extent of his own suffering behind a podium because duty required the appearance of calm. Elizabeth had spent 7 decades volunteering almost nothing of her own inner life to anyone outside her closest circle. Diana, in a single hour of unscripted, unauthorized television, said out loud what the institution had spent nearly 80 years training every single one of its members never to say: that the fairy tale had a cost, that the people living inside it suffered in ways the carefully managed public image never showed. The palace's instinct, in the weeks and months that followed, was to do what it had always done: manage, contain, wait for public attention to move on to something else. The same strategy that had worked, with varying degrees of success, since 1917. This time, the strategy was about to run directly into something the institution had never encountered before. Not in this exact form. A genuine, overwhelming wave of public grief, arriving with almost no warning at all, that would force Elizabeth to do something she had spent her entire reign avoiding: step outside the family's traditional rules of careful, controlled silence, in full view of the entire watching world. Paris, August the 31st, 1997. Shortly after midnight, a car carrying Diana, Princess of Wales, crashed in a tunnel beside the Seine River while being pursued by photographers on motorcycles, and within hours, the woman who had spent a decade and a half teaching the world's media exactly how to look at her was dead at 36 years old. The news reached Britain in the early hours of the morning, and what followed over the next several days became one of the strangest and most consequential periods in the entire modern history of the British monarchy. A week in which an institution built on careful, measured control found itself almost completely unprepared for the scale and intensity of the public reaction unfolding outside its own gates. Within hours of the news breaking, people began arriving outside Kensington Palace, Diana's official residence, carrying flowers. By the end of the first day, that scattering of bouquets had grown into a sea of them, spreading across the palace gates, along the surrounding railings, eventually covering an area so large that news coverage described it as a literal field of flowers, the scent of which, according to people who visited in person, could reportedly be smelled from a considerable distance away. Crowds gathered not just to lay tributes, but to stand, sometimes for hours, in a kind of collective public mourning that had no obvious modern precedent in British history. People who had never met Diana, who knew her only through television coverage and magazine photographs, wept openly in public, embraced strangers, standing beside them in the same crowd, and waited in lines, stretching for many hours, simply for the chance to sign a book of condolence. And while all of this was happening in London, the royal family itself was nowhere to be seen. Elizabeth, along with Charles and Diana's two young sons, William and Harry, ages 15 and 12, were at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the family's private summer residence, hundreds of miles away from the growing crowds in London. The Queen's instinct, by every account, from people close to the family during this period, was rooted in exactly the same logic that had guided her entire approach to public duty for over 4 decades. Grief, in her understanding of the role, was a private matter, something to be processed quietly within the family, away from cameras, with public composure maintained as a matter of basic dignity and respect for the children who had just lost their mother. She believed, sincerely, that shielding William and Harry from the full intensity of the public spectacle unfolding in London was the right and protective thing to do. What this meant, in practical terms, was that for nearly a week after Diana's death, the royal family remained almost entirely silent and almost entirely invisible. No public statement from the Queen, no flag lowered at Buckingham Palace, because royal protocol, going back centuries, dictated that the flag only flew at all when the monarch was actually in residence, and never at half-mast, even then, a rule built for an entirely different era that had never anticipated a moment like this one. To a grieving public desperate for some visible sign that the family shared even a fraction of what they were feeling, the empty flagpole above Buckingham Palace became, within days, an object of genuine public anger. British tabloid newspapers, never an institution known for gentleness toward the royal family, even in calmer times, began running headlines that would have been almost unthinkable a decade earlier, directed at a reigning monarch. "Show us you care." Read one of the most widely remembered front pages. "Where is our Queen?" asked another. The institution that had survived a world war by standing on a balcony in a bombed city, the institution that had built its entire modern identity around the principle of visible, shared presence with its own people, was now being accused, in the most public possible terms, of the exact opposite: coldness, distance, a failure to show up at the precise moment its own people needed to see it most. This represents the most direct collision in this entire family's history between the two competing survival strategies that had been quietly at war since Diana's wedding day in 1981. Elizabeth's approach: control emotion, maintain dignity, let actions rather than public displays speak for themselves, had worked for the better part of a century. It had carried the family through abdication, through war, through the loss of an empire, but it had been built in an earlier media era, one in which the public's relationship with the monarchy was shaped by carefully released images and formal statements rather than the constant, intimate, emotionally driven coverage that television, and Diana herself, had spent the previous decade and a half training the public to expect. By 1997, the public Elizabeth was trying to serve was simply not the same public her father had served during the Blitz. They had been taught, in large part by Diana's own example, to expect visible emotion from public figures, to read restraint not as dignity but as indifference. The Crown's oldest survival tool, controlled, dignified silence, was, for the first time in its modern history, actively working against it rather than for it. Advisors inside the palace, watching public anger climb by the day, eventually convinced Elizabeth that the situation required something she had never done before in 45 years on the throne. She agreed to return to London early, to allow the flag above Buckingham Palace to fly at half-mast as an exception to centuries of tradition, and to deliver a live televised address to the nation. A direct, personal broadcast acknowledging Diana's death and the public's grief. The broadcast aired on the 5th of September, the day before Diana's funeral, and Elizabeth, speaking from Buckingham Palace with the crowds and the flowers visible just beyond the windows behind her, spoke of Diana as a remarkable person, acknowledged the depth of the public grief directly, and described herself deliberately, speaking not only as a queen, but as a grandmother. A small but carefully chosen phrase intended to signal exactly the kind of personal, human connection. The public had spent the previous week accusing the family of failing to show it worked, in the sense that the most acute public anger began to subside almost immediately after the broadcast aired. The funeral itself, the following day, drew enormous crowds lining the procession route through London, and an estimated worldwide television audience in the hundreds of millions. Larger even than Diana and Charles's wedding 16 years earlier had attracted, watching a service that blended formal royal ceremony with deeply personal tributes, including a eulogy from Diana's brother that contained a pointed, unmistakable critique of how the royal family and the press had treated her during her lifetime, delivered inside Westminster Abbey, with members of that same family seated only a few feet away. What this week revealed, more clearly than anything in the previous 80 years of this family's history, was the precise limit of the survival strategy George V had first established in 1917. Becoming what the public needs you to be had always assumed that the institution could correctly read what the public actually needed at any given moment. For most of the century, that assumption had held. In the week after Diana's death, for the first time, it had failed, badly and publicly, and only a rapid, uncomfortable course correction had managed to close the gap before it became something the institution could not recover from at all. The lesson did not disappear once the immediate crisis passed. It settled into the family's understanding of itself for the following decades. A quiet but permanent recalibration. Survival no longer meant simply controlling the story. It meant staying close enough to public feeling to sense, correctly and quickly, when the old rules no longer applied, that lesson would be tested again, within a generation, by two more members of this family who would once again use the very same tool, a deeply personal, unscripted, televised interview to tell their own version of events directly to a global audience. Only this time, the audience watching would be largely American, and the story they told would reach further than anything Diana herself had ever attempted. St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, May the 19th, 2018. A woman walked alone down part of the aisle of a chapel that had stood on the grounds of Windsor Castle for over 500 years, before Charles stepped forward part way to walk the rest of the distance beside her, and an estimated global television audience, numbering in the hundreds of millions, watched an American woman become a member of the British royal family. She was Meghan Markle, an American actress from Los Angeles, and the man waiting for her at the altar was Prince Harry, the younger son of Charles and Diana, the boy, who had been 12 years old, walking behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London. On the day this entire story's most painful chapter had reached its conclusion 2 decades earlier, the wedding itself was, by most measures, a genuinely joyful, modern occasion, blending traditional royal ceremony with deliberate touches that signaled something new. An African-American bishop delivering a passionate, gospel-inflected sermon about the power of love inside the same chapel where British monarchs had been married for centuries. A gospel choir performing inside Windsor's ancient stone walls. A cellist playing music more commonly heard at concert halls than coronations. It is worth being precise about why this particular marriage carried so much weight, beyond the simple fact that any royal wedding draws global attention. Meghan's mother is African American, and her father is white, and she was widely understood, in the modern media age, as the first woman of mixed-race heritage to marry into the senior working ranks of the British royal family. That fact alone, set against a family whose very name had once been changed specifically to Project Pure, uncomplicated Britishness, represented a genuine and visible evolution in what this institution was prepared to look like in public. She was also American, divorced, and several years older than Harry. 3 characteristics that, taken together, would have made her an almost unthinkable match for the family only a few decades earlier. In the era when Edward had been forced off the throne for choosing a woman who checked some of those same boxes, for nearly 3 years, the marriage played out in front of cameras with the same intensity that had followed Diana decades earlier, except now amplified by social media, 24-hour news cycles, and a level of direct, unfiltered public commentary that simply had not existed during Diana's lifetime. And by early 2020, the strain had become public in its own right. Harry and Meghan announced, through a statement posted directly to social media rather than through any official palace channel, that they intended to step back from their roles as senior working members of the royal family and seek what they described as financial independence, eventually relocating permanently to California. The British press response was immediate and largely unforgiving, and the speed and tone of that coverage, particularly toward Meghan, became its own significant part of the story, with Harry himself later describing what he characterized as a pattern of coverage that he believed his wife had been subjected to in a way. His mother, despite everything Diana had suffered from the same tabloid press, had not. Then, in March of 2021, came the moment that would echo Diana's 1995 Panorama interview almost precisely, except this time delivered not to a British broadcaster, but to an American one. Sitting across from Oprah Winfrey in a televised interview watched by an estimated audience of over 17 million people in the United States alone, with many millions more watching around the world, The interview covered enormous ground. Meghan's account of struggling with suicidal thoughts during her time as a working royal, her description of being denied adequate mental health support from within the institution when she sought it, and most explosively, an allegation that an unnamed member of the royal family had, before the birth of her and Harry's first child, raised what she described as concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be. Harry, sitting beside her, spoke about his own strained relationship with his father and brother, and described feeling that his family had, in his words, been trapped within their own roles, unable or unwilling to offer the kind of support he and Meghan needed during their most difficult moments inside the institution. Set this interview directly beside Diana's, because the parallel is too precise to ignore. Once again, a member of this family had walked into a television studio without the palace's coordination or approval and used the camera, the same tool George VI had once used to rally a nation, and Elizabeth had once used to crown herself in front of millions, to tell a version of events that directly contradicted the institution's carefully maintained public image. Once again, the interview generated headlines for weeks, forced a public response from the family, and reopened questions about exactly how much suffering this institution required from the people living inside it in exchange for the stability and continuity it provided to everyone else. But there was something different happening here too. Something specific to this particular moment in this family's long, recurring pattern of individuals choosing themselves over the institution's preferred silence. Diana's revelations in 1995 had been almost entirely a British story, watched and processed primarily through a British cultural lens, a nation working through its complicated feelings about its own monarchy. Harry and Meghan's interview, airing first to an American audience on an American network with an American host whose name alone carried enormous cultural authority in the United States, was something else. It was the moment the House of Windsor's internal contradictions, the same tension between duty and self that had run underneath this family's story since Edward first chose Wallis Simpson over the crown in 1936, became, for an American audience watching, a story about themselves as much as a story about a distant royal family. It would be a mistake to read this chapter, as so much tabloid coverage at the time tried to, as a simple morality tale with clear villains and clear victims. Harry and Meghan did not invent the tension between personal happiness and institutional duty that defines this family. They inherited it. The same tension that destroyed Edward's relationship with his own brother. The same tension that quietly ended Margaret's engagement to Peter Townsend. The same tension that Diana herself had tried, imperfectly and at enormous personal cost, to resolve a generation earlier. What Harry and Meghan revealed was how old this particular bargain had become, and how little, in nearly 100 years, since George V first asked his family to give up its name for the sake of public image, the fundamental terms of that bargain had actually changed. The institution's response, this time, was notably different from how it had handled Diana's interview a generation earlier. Rather than retreating into total silence, the Queen issued a relatively swift public statement, acknowledging that the family took the allegations, particularly those concerning race, very seriously, and that some recollections may vary. A carefully worded phrase that managed to express concern without conceding any specific factual claim. Silence, in the modern media environment, was no longer survivable on its own. What was clear, by the time the Oprah interview finished airing, was that the same camera, the Windsors had first invited into Westminster Abbey nearly 70 years earlier. The tool that had once saved this family by making it visible had now, for the second time in a generation, been turned directly against the institution by someone who had once stood inside its innermost circle. The family that survived the 20th century by learning to control its own story was entering the 21st century, having lost, more than once now, the ability to fully control who got to tell it. Windsor Castle, September the 19th, 2022. A coffin draped in the royal standard, topped with the imperial state crown and a single wreath of white flowers, was carried into St. George's Chapel, the same chapel where Harry and Meghan had married 4 years earlier, the same chapel that had stood on this hill for more than 5 centuries, and inside it, Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest beside the husband, parents, and sister she had outlived by years, in some cases by decades. She had died 11 days earlier at Balmoral, the same Scottish estate where she and the rest of the family had been staying during the terrible week following Diana's death a quarter century before, at the age of 96, after a reign that had lasted 70 years, longer than any monarch in British history. Longer than any monarch most people alive at the time of her death had ever known. What followed her death was a period of public mourning on a scale that even the extraordinary outpouring after Diana's death had not quite prepared the country for. An estimated 250,000 people queued for hours, in some cases over 24 hours, stretching for miles along the banks of the Thames, simply for the chance to file past her coffin as it lay in state inside Westminster Hall for a few seconds each. The funeral itself, held at Westminster Abbey before her coffin was finally brought to Windsor for burial, drew a global television audience estimated in the hundreds of millions, watched in countries that had never been part of the empire she was born into, and had spent her entire reign overseeing the careful, gradual dismantling of she had inherited, in 1952, a position still formally connected to a sprawling global empire, countries across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean that recognized the British monarch as their own head of state. By the time she died, 70 years later, that empire had almost entirely dissolved, nation after nation choosing independence, several of them eventually choosing to remove the monarchy from their own constitutions altogether. The throne Elizabeth left behind for her son Charles ruled over a vastly smaller, vastly less powerful version of the kingdom. Her grandfather, George V, had once worried about losing entirely to a single unfortunate name, and yet the crown itself, the institution, the family, the name Windsor that had been invented in a moment of wartime panic in 1917, was still standing, still drawing extraordinary crowds, still commanding a level of global media attention that few other institutions on earth, royal or otherwise, could come close to matching. Charles became King Charles III the moment his mother died. At 73 years old, the oldest person ever to ascend the British throne, a man who had spent more time waiting to become king, over 70 years as heir apparent, than any monarch in the country's history. His early months on the throne were watched with a particular kind of scrutiny, partly because of his own long and complicated public history, the failed marriage to Diana, the years spent as a controversial figure for his relationship with Camilla, whom he had finally married in 2005, and who was crowned Queen Consort beside him in May of 2023, and partly because his reign was beginning at a moment when the institution's relationship with the public felt genuinely less settled than at almost any point since the difficult years following Diana's death. Behind Charles, in the line of succession, stands his elder son, Prince William, now Prince of Wales, a title that once belonged to his own father, and that carries with it, by this point, an almost unavoidable historical weight, a constant reminder of the mother William lost as a boy, and the complicated, scrutinized marriage that had once defined this same title before him. William and his wife Catherine have, by most public measures, positioned themselves as a study in deliberate caution, careful, controlled, visibly committed to a more measured, less openly emotional version of public life than either Diana or, later, Harry and Meghan had practiced. Whether that caution reflects a genuine personal temperament, or a lesson absorbed from watching what happened to nearly every other branch of his own family that chose openness instead, is a question this generation will likely spend years answering through its own choices, rather than through anything said publicly today. Behind William stand his own 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, each of them born directly into a line of succession that stretches back, in an unbroken constitutional thread, to the moment George V sat down at his desk in 1917 and decided that the only way to save this family was to change its name. It is worth returning, one final time, to that desk, and to that decision, because everything this family has lived through in the century since flows directly out of the principle George established that day. Blood alone would not save them. The Romanovs had blood, and ended in a basement. The Habsburgs had blood, centuries of it, and ended in dissolution and exile. What the Windsors had instead, starting with that single act of self-reinvention, was a willingness to give up pieces of themselves, generation after generation, in exchange for the public's continued willingness to believe in what remained. George V gave up the family name. Edward gave up the throne rather than give up the woman he loved, and discovered that the institution would let him walk rather than bend its own rules to keep him. George VI gave up any pretense that the crown could remain comfortably private, fighting through his own stammer in public because the war demanded a voice the country could hold on to. Elizabeth gave up almost the entirety of her own private self for 70 years, allowing the camera into the most sacred room in the kingdom, and never once, in public, letting the country see anything other than the steady, unbroken continuity she had promised on her 21st birthday. Margaret gave up the man she loved for a sister's reign that was never going to be hers. Diana gave up her silence, and in doing so, gave the institution a wound it has never fully closed. Harry gave up his place inside the family entirely, choosing, like his great-great-uncle Edward before him, the harder and lonelier path of writing his own story rather than continuing to perform someone else's. Every single one of these choices, made across 5 generations and more than 100 years, returns to the same 2 symbols this story has carried from its very first chapter. The name on the paper, the story this family has been writing and rewriting about itself since the moment a German title became too dangerous to keep, and the balcony, the place where, whether they wanted to or not, every single one of them eventually had to step outside, into the light, and let themselves be seen by the people whose belief was the only thing actually holding any of it together. Windsor Castle still stands on its hill above the Thames today, 900 years old, having outlasted the family that first built it, having lent its name to a dynasty that has now carried it for over a century, having watched kings be crowned and buried within its walls, weddings celebrated and broken apart, a stammering boy become a wartime king, and a girl in a tree in Kenya become a queen who would outlive nearly everyone she ever loved. The House of Windsor was born from fear, in a small room, with a single signature on a single piece of paper. It survived 100 years of war, scandal, abdication, grief, and a level of public exposure no royal family in human history had ever previously been asked to endure, not by holding fast to the unchanging weight of an ancient bloodline, but by proving, again and again, generation after generation, that it was willing to become whatever its own survival required. The castle is still standing. The name their grandfather chose is still being carried. But the question George V answered in 1917 has never actually been settled for good. It has only ever been answered for one generation at a time, and somewhere ahead, in the life of a young prince who will likely carry this crown himself one day. The same question is already waiting for him. The question this entire family has never been allowed to stop answering since a king first sat down at a desk and picked up a pen. How much of yourself are you willing to give away to keep the crown?